this is why this idea that Isaiah 53 is speaking about Israel is really, from a Torah perspective, completely nonsensical. It's common sense that the prophets of Israel suffer for the sins of Israel. In other words, it pleases the Almighty to send prophets to do His will, even though they will end up suffering. Why? For the greater good, for those that actually do listen, for those who actually remain faithful. Because even throughout Jewish history, like whenever Israel has stumbled, whenever they were exiled, there was always that remnant that, you know what, not only remember the words of the prophets, actually wrote them down and carried them on to the next generation, who, by the previous generation's example, learned and didn't repeat their mistakes. They listened to their future prophets. And you know what? There are actually a lot more prophets that appear in our books of the prophets today. These are just the ones that we're aware of. The Almighty has sent many prophets who suffered at the hands of wicked Israel, i.e., who took upon themselves the sin of Israel in some hyperbolic, poetic sense. And friends, the reason I think it's so important to understand the idea of suffering in Torah Judaism properly is because it's one of the main reasons, or one of the main excuses people use to leave the Jewish religion. To quote Elie Wiesel, who actually grew up religious and dropped religion after the Holocaust, he said that he had no problem believing that the Jews had a special mission in this world, but he left the religion because he realized that it was a suicide mission. Friends, this only ultimately hurts us and that helps us. And I know that it feels good sometimes to play the underdog, but ultimately it makes you a worse individual. Mainly because people with this victim mentality cannot be happy individuals walking around that no matter what you do, you're destined to fail. And this is one reason I give for this somber attitude in the Jewish world. This notion that, all the fetching, all the stereotypes attached to Jews that, you know what, paint us as unhappy individuals. And this is something that the Torah does not endorse. Actually, if you think about it, this is the only way contextually that narrative makes sense, right? From the beginning of Isaiah all the way to 52, 53, it's talking about Israel not listening, Jacob being stubborn. And now suddenly in Isaiah 53, it's talking about Israel pointing their fingers at the wicked nations. That makes absolutely no sense.
Let us go to the scripture in Tanakh, because I believe that this is a lack of study, careful study of the entire Tanakh. The focus is not the entire Tanakh, which we will focus on in this presentation. Let me start by paraphrasing, I hope you'll check it out for yourself, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1, where I'm paraphrasing here, but it says very carefully. It says, "Comfort, comfort my people Israel. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem." And it says there very clearly, tell her that her sins are accomplished. It's over. Why? It says, because she has received double the punishment for her sins. Double. We see in Zechariah chapter 1 verse 15, God says, I am very angry with the nations who are very, very pompous and arrogant about their role in the suffering of Israel. Though I was a little angry, they furthered the evil against my people. That's in Zechariah chapter 1 verse 15. I'm paraphrasing. That's what he's saying there. Read it for yourselves. Very clear. They're going too far. The nations have gone too far. Historically, Israel has suffered way more than what was intended for them to suffer. And I'll go into that in great detail in a little bit, but let's just stick to the scriptures first. In Jeremiah chapter 50 verse 7, it says, all who came upon them devoured them, and their adversaries have said, we are not guilty, inasmuch as they have sinned against the Lord, who is the habitation of righteousness, even against the Lord, the hope of their fathers. This is what the nations are saying. Look, they're suffering because they turned against the Lord. They turned against God. God is against them. That's the message. And we see that all over. If you ask any honest Christian or Messianic or Muslim, they will say, if you ask them, Why is Israel suffering so much? Why have they suffered historically? They will say the Jewish people have suffered historically because they have rejected God, they rejected their Messiah, they rejected the prophet, and on and on and on. Let's keep going. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 3. Israel is holy to Yehovah, the Lord, the first of his harvest. All who devour him will be guilty. See, very clear, God says, all who devour Israel will be held guilty. Evil will come upon them, declares the Lord. Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 25. Pour out thy wrath upon the nations that do not know you, and upon the families who do not call upon your name. For they have devoured Jacob. They have devoured him. Same message over and over and over again. We see in Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 10. This they will have in return for their pride, because they have taunted and became arrogant against the people of Yehovah, the Lord of hosts. Psalm chapter 79, verses 4 through 7. We have become a reproach to our neighbors, a scoffing and derision to those around us. How long, O Lord, O Yehovah, will you be angry forever? Will your jealousy burn like fire? Pour out your wrath upon the nations which do not know you, and upon the kingdoms which do not call upon your name. For they have devoured Jacob, this is Israel, and laid waste his habitation. Psalm 83, verses 1 through 4. O God, do not remain quiet, do not be silent, do not be still. For behold, your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you have exalted themselves. They make shrewd plans against your treasured ones. We see that all around. The whole United Nations is against Israel, planning on their destruction. The surrounding nations around Israel, all of the Arab countries, are planning the destruction every single day against Israel from day one. This is all prophesied in Scripture, that this would happen. This is how we know we are Israel, because the nations of the world hate us. They are using weapons, bombing us. This is historical suffering that was described in Tanakh for thousands of years. And it has come to pass over and over. They have said, in verse 4 of Psalms chapter 83, verse 4, they have said, meaning the nations, the evil ones against Israel, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let us wipe them out as a nation, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. Sound familiar? If you haven't heard this, you must have been sleeping under a rock. This is all you hear about. Israel, the root of all evil, even though they're the smallest country, smaller than New Jersey, surrounded by nations that are plotting the destruction every single day. It's exactly what Tanakh says would happen. All right, Psalm 94, verses 3 through 5. How long shall the wicked, O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? They pour forth words, they speak arrogantly. All who do wickedness vaunt themselves. They crush thy people, O Lord, and afflict thy heritage. Over and over and over again. This is why the suffering servant is described as being led to the slaughter. Look at this, Psalms 44, verses 12 through 21. It says, you have given us as sheep to the slaughter, and have scattered us among the nations. You sell your people for no great gain. You have not put their price high. You have made us a reproach to our neighbors, a scoffing, a derision to those around us. You have made us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the nations. All day long my dishonor is before me, and my humiliation is overwhelming me, because of the voice of him who reproaches and reviles, because of the presence of the enemy and the avenger. We see this throughout history, over and over and over again. Suffering, 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 even from the time of the Second Temple, when the Romans were ruling over Israel. Josephus and many historians declare that there were over 100,000 Jews. Let me say that again. Over 100,000 Jews who were crucified over 100,000 Jews crucified. It said that they crucified so many Jews that they actually ran out of lumber. They had to order more lumber from Lebanon. The Jews were just massacred on massive scales, even before the Jewish war between Rome and Israel. Way before that, they were suffering, being slaughtered, and then the war in 66 through 70, which ended up in the Second Temple destruction. Millions were killed, slaughtered, taken into slavery, taken in slave ships in the year 70, shipped off to Egypt and other parts, ended up in Europe and all other places. In the Middle Ages, when many of us went to Europe from Israel, from 28 years right after the year 70, already the church fathers were writing about us, talking about how much they hated us, how they were going to wipe us out, burn our synagogues, slaughter us, that we would never go back to Israel because of killing their Christ, their Messiah. We find this from the beginning of the Middle Ages all the way through almost till the 1900s. Non-stop hate, suffering. Even during the Black Plague, they accused the Jewish people of polluting the waters, poisoning the waters, causing the Black Plague. We went through 3 crusades, which were literally like 3 holocausts. Non-stop suffering. The Middle Ages were a disaster for the Jewish people. A huge disaster. Millions. 3 crusades. Then eventually we get to the Holocaust and so on. A lot of people, idiots that deny the Holocaust, are just fooling themselves. We did go through the Holocaust. It was horrible. Still today, the anti-Semitism has grown ever since the state of Israel was put to place. From day one, non-stop wars, suffering. And the scriptures declares over and over again that this is what would happen to Israel before the end comes. Jeremiah chapter 31 says, "No weapon forged against you will succeed. If the sun, the moon, and the stars shall be ceased to be before me, so too will I wipe out Israel from being a nation before me." In Zechariah chapter 14, it talks about the great war that will happen before the Messianic age, when there will be all these nations coming against Israel. This is Gog and Magog. Great wars among, it'll be during a time of Jacob's trouble. That's what it means, Jacob's trouble. But you will be rescued from it. We see this painted throughout Isaiah, throughout Zechariah. This is completely a biblical argument, over and over and over again. So like I said before, Israel suffered way more than what was intended. And many people will think, you know what? I think God is punishing Israel too much. That's the point. God is telling you in Tanakh that it's gone way too far. It's gone way too far. The suffering has been going on nonstop. It's been just way overboard. And so that's why Israel is the suffering servant who will be vindicated. And you see this painted throughout Isaiah.